Hi there. In this video, I'm going to go over the timeline that's been established so far for House of the Dragon Season 1, in terms of calendar dates and character ages. How old TV characters are, like Rhaenyra, Alicent, Laena, etc., and how sometimes these character ages and dates were changed relative to the books. Because, like Game of Thrones, they had to age up some of the younger characters, though not all of them. And when they had to age them up, they added extra years into the timeline to account for that. So far, I'll tell you right at the beginning, this isn't a complaint. They have actually kept pretty consistent track of all this. All the numbers do match up, if read in one way out of a couple of options, that, okay, this must be what they're doing. And I worked through it backwards, but yes, this is all consistent math. I'm actually impressed. Because relative to that, Game of Thrones consciously avoided ever stating a calendar year in dialogue. They were worried that they would contradict themselves, so their ingenious answer was just avoid giving dates altogether. Can't give a wrong date. You can't mix up your dates if you never give any at all. That, would only draw more attention to, wow, it took Littlefinger 1 day to get from King's Landing to Harrenhal using his jetpack, if you say in dialogue, it took me 1 day, or dragons zipping to the wall in a matter of hours from Dragonstone in Season 7. That they tried to avoid giving numbers, and for years they also completely avoided giving calendar dates, because they were worried about contradicting themselves, and that would be work, so they didn't do it. But even then, broadly, and they weren't paying attention to it, broadly, even they had to acknowledge that one TV season equaled roughly 1 year of in-universe story time, due to the fact that the child actors were aging in real time. So Arya is stated on screen to be 11 in Season 1, and 7 years later she's 18 in Season 8. That's fine. There's other things that they didn't get right. Some seasons are shorter, some are longer, but on average, overall, across the entire run of the show, yes, 7 years pass. But they avoided all mention of the calendar system. The first novel begins in the year 298 AC, or after Conquest. Their calendar is based on the Targaryen conquest, when Aegon I was crowned king at the end of all the fighting and then forged the Iron Throne. So, after 8 seasons of never mentioning that in dialogue, it was really surprising with Episode 1 that, right at the beginning, the cold open prologue's voiceover narration by adult Rhaenyra states, "The Great Council in the year 101, which is the same year the Great Council was in the books. They didn't change that. What they did change is, right after that, they have a prominent title card saying, the 9th year of Viserys' reign, when in the books, Queen Aemma died in the 2nd year of his reign. So they added 7 years in there, which is good, that we knew they were going to do this, that they would need to age up the younger cast members. This is directly comparable to what Game of Thrones did with Daenerys, because her father, the Mad King, died at the end of Robert's Rebellion, and she was born months later. Her birth is tied to the date of the war. In the books, the war was 15 years before the story begins, and she turns 14 in her 2nd chapter. Problem is that under UK filming law, you can't legally depict a character younger than 16 having sex or getting married, regardless of the actor's age. What matters is the age of the fictional character being depicted. In the US, it's different. You can do what's called Dawson casting, where you have adults unconvincingly playing teenagers. You can't do that with UK law. That Emilia Clarke was actually 23 years old when she filmed Season 1. But what mattered was you cannot show a 14-year-old Daenerys getting married and having sex. She has to be 16. They had no choice. This isn't even something the showrunners did. Any showrunner in this position. George R. Martin himself, just in any attempt to make an adaptation of his work, that this is a medieval society where people marry younger, anyone in that position, they need to age up the younger characters, and this is going to be an issue for both this and other prequels going forward. I mean, even the graphic novel adaptation of the books, which is moving very slowly because it's very faithful, it only recently finished the second novel. It's done by Daniel Abraham from The Expanse, does the graphic novel. There's this article he did 10 years ago when he was still working on the beginning saying, similar to the TV show, that I tried to be closer to the source, but one thing I had no control over was I had to age up Daenerys by 2 years because there's laws against how old you can, depict underage nudity and stuff. That she has to be of legal age to depict it for comic book law. So that's going to be a factor across all of this, the age of the character being depicted. They had to add an extra 2 years. So instead of Robert's Rebellion being 15 years ago at the beginning of the story, they consistently say it's 17 years ago. And this had a ripple effect on all the character ages that are tied to that, not just Daenerys. They said it was explicitly because Daenerys has sex in the first episode. But Jon Snow's birth is also tied to the war because his mother died giving birth to him at the end of it. Also, Robb Stark is roughly the same age because Ned left a pregnant Catelyn behind when he went off to fight in the Battle of the Trident. And because you don't want to work with really young actors, and I agree, you can't convincingly have a 3-year-old doing stuff that much, they generally aged up everyone else by 2 years. So Arya is actually 9 at the beginning of the story in the books. She states she's 11 in season 1. But Rickon went from being 3 to being 6, but that's fine, you don't want really small children. Generally, the rule is everyone get aged up 2 years. That's the magic number then. For House of the Dragon, our magic number is 7, and it's a good number, number 7. That this is our 15 to 17 Robert's Rebellion thing. This time around, it's the 7 years they added, that it's not the 2nd year of his reign, it's the 9th year of his reign. But the Great Council at Harrenhal happens in the year 101 in both versions. So we get a clear indication here of where they inserted those extra years. That there's a baseline of it's 101. So do we add 9 years to 101? Not necessarily, because in the books at least, old King Jaehaerys didn't die for another 2 years, and Viserys only succeeded him in the year 103. If that same gap happened in the TV show universe, that there was 2 years before he actually became king, because Jaehaerys wasn't dead yet, well, 2 plus 9 years of his rule is 11, and 11 plus 101 is 112. Stands to reason that episode 1 of season 1 is in the calendar year 112 after Conquest. Now, originally I was going to make this video after the first episode, but then some reporters I know who get screener copies told me, hold off on that because they do give more character ages, stated character ages in dialogue in the second episode. So that's why I'm doing this now, that they say how old Rhaenyra is, and they'll say how old Laena is. And now here we are, episode 2, which is half a year later. They say it's been almost half a year, but let's go with it. It's still the same calendar year, like from March to August or something. Okay, it's half a year. They state Rhaenyra is 15 years old, and that Laena Velaryon is 12 years old. While it's possible they changed her birth date, let's assume it's the same as in the books to start with. It was in the year 97 AC. And the extra 7 years to Rhaenyra's age were only added in the years after Viserys became king. So book Rhaenyra was 4 at the time of the Great Council, 6 when her father became king, and about 8 2 years later when her mother died. Add another 7 years to 8 and you get 15. So yeah, that's how old they stated Rhaenyra is, as you see in the math here. That completely checks out. She was 8 at this point when her mother died in the books. Add 7, you get 15. Which you see reinforces that there was that 2-year gap, that Jaehaerys reigned another 2 years. That, okay, this isn't just, it's 94 or 98. It looks like they're using her exact birth date from the books, with that many years added to it. So that gap of 2 years happened, then 9, and this reinforces we are living in episode 1 in the year 112 AC. The other big change is that in the books, Alicent's actually 9 years older than Rhaenyra. but Alicent is explicitly described as looking young for her age. She's just one of those, round faces. She looks young for her age. She holds up well. And Rhaenyra looks a bit older for her age, particularly by the time she's an adult, when she has a lot of pregnancies that she doesn't carry well, that they say it aged her a bit. So it looks like they're 2 or 3 years apart in the books, that she looks like she could be Rhaenyra's older sister. That Alicent the age gap is small enough, she could never have been Rhaenyra's biological mother. And they were close at first. I mean, they play that up in the show, but, well, Rhaenyra's birth date wasn't changed, so she got hit with those extra 7 years. In contrast, Alicent's birth date apparently was changed, that they wanted her the same age when Aemma dies, so they moved her birth date up. She didn't experience the added 7 years, which closes the age gap. That if the gap was 9 years in the books, minus 7, it's a gap of like 1 to 2-ish years. Which, yeah, looking at them, it looks like Alicent is maybe a year or two older than Rhaenyra. Then we come to Laena Velaryon, who the TV show just explicitly stated is 12 years old, the same age that she was in the books when Queen Aemma died, because it's a plot point that she's really too young for Viserys to seriously consider marrying. And even her parents, in the show, even her parents say that we don't really expect you to bed him for a couple of years. That was the thing with Sansa in the books and TV series. They had that line that, well, in the books she's 11 when she's betrothed to Joffrey, 13 in the show, but they say we can just betroth them and hold off on an actual marriage for a couple of years until she's older. But Laena is in the same situation that Alicent is, that her birth date was moved so that she'd be the same age she was in the books when Alicent dies. Her birth date got moved later, which is interesting for the Great Council. The ripple effects of that, the thing about it, that the Great Council of 101 was a little simplified from the books, that the final 2 candidates weren't Viserys and Rhaenys, but Viserys and Rhaenys' son Laenor, Laena's younger brother. And I don't mind, this is just streamlining it, yes, and generally speaking in the books, it was seen as a vote between Rhaenys' bloodline and Viserys' bloodline. So even I loosely say it was like a vote between Rhaenys and Viserys' branches of the family, but there's no mention of Laenor there. And I wouldn't mind it simplifying it, but how are they simplifying it in universe that actually works out too? Because if it's 112 AC now, and Laena's 12, that means she was born a year before the Great Council. Well, in the books, Rhaenys' father, Aemon, was the eldest son and crown prince of Jaehaerys. He died in a minor skirmish with pirates in the year 92 AC. Rhaenys was pregnant with Laena at the time and argued that, not only am I Aemon's lawful heir, I might be pregnant with a boy and you're passing him over. But after they already did for Baelon, Viserys' father, she ultimately had a girl, it turned out, but they couldn't have known that. She gave birth to Laena the next year, 93 AC. And the year after that, to her son Laenor, 94 AC. And it gives the numbers in the book that a reason a lot of people didn't support Laenor at the Great Council is because he was only a 7-year-old boy, compared to Viserys, who was a much older, established man. He was an established lord and administrator. So if we move 7-year-old Laenor ahead 7 years, he hasn't been born yet. Simple as that. So the math checks out of why did they cut mention of TV Laenor in the TV Great Council. They did account for that. They didn't just go, well, why not through a woman to his son? Apparently he was born the year after the Great Council in the TV show. I don't know if they'll mention that by episode 4 or 5 or something. It'd be nice if they did. But this checks out. They didn't make any number mistakes with this. One issue, and this is not a mistake, getting back to, separate from that now, the title card that Daenerys is born 172 years after episode 1. By our math, if we're reinforcing, look, for Rhaenyra to be 15, this has to be the year 112, or that the writers are going with. 112 plus 172 is 284. 284 AC is Daenerys' birth year in the books. Remember, they added 2 years. But they only added 2 years relative to Robert's Rebellion. They said now it's 17 years since Robert's Rebellion. And on fan sites, fan wikis, we had a question. It comes up more than you think. Whenever we had to date any character profile, just anything involving the timeline, that they didn't give a solid year. And they intentionally avoided it because they didn't want to contradict themselves, which is lazy. So the question was, there's one of two options. Either the rebellion happened 2 years earlier, or the calendar year is 2 years later. Then it looks like the old showrunners kind of forgot to coordinate with this with their props department, because all of the props in Game of Thrones Season 1, like prop letters from King Robert and stuff, state it's the year 298 AC. That, going by props, which is all we had, fan wikis and stuff, we went with, well, I guess in the TV universe, the rebellion happened 2 years earlier, if it's still 298, the same start year. So they are going with, I don't know, I'd ask in like a Reddit AMA or something, if the writers ever do some obscure thing for that. Hey, did you just not notice that the TV show added 2 years to Daenerys' birth date? It's not necessarily a mistake, because there were one of two options. Either make her born earlier, which we had been using as the number since 2011. For fan wikis, we said, well, I guess the rebellion happened 2 years earlier. We can just shift that to say, okay, screw it, Game of Thrones Season 1 happened in the year 300, not 298, and because 7 years pass for every season, the final season is 307 or something. Academic at this point, because these are prequels anyway, but I don't think they necessarily made a mistake. Maybe they're going with the other option that it happened 2 years later, but that's a whole other separate thing. We don't have to worry about that for this prequel era, but their numbers generally check out if you use her book birth date, and, well, it went forward 2 years instead of backwards 2 years. But overall, I'm happy with all this. All of these numbers check out. Plot point that Laena is only 12, so they pushed her forward. They wanted Rhaenyra closer in age to Alicent, so Alicent wasn't accordingly aged up. Rhaenyra seems to have the same birth date she did in the books. And, dear God, we have actual calendar years to apply to things, the way like Star Wars fans can use the after or before Battle of Yavin system for, and they usually are consistent with that when they give dates for things in timeline books, that now we can date things, establishing that, okay, Episode 1 is the year 112, Episode 2 is, okay, it's 6 months later in the same calendar year. There will be time skips throughout the rest of the season, but we'll try to see if those are consistent relative to each other, and we'll see where this goes by the end of the season. Because there are 3 major time skips in Season 1 that will require recasting. That I know that from spy photos, when Laena and Laenor show up again in Episode 4 at the latest, they're played by teenagers opposite the teenaged Millie Alcock, so there's apparently a bigger time skip between Episodes 2 and 3. But it's the smallest of the 3 big ones, that there's like a 10-year jump mid-season when they switch to adult Rhaenyra and adult Alicent. And there's apparently another skip of like 5-6 years around between Episodes 7 and 8 when they switch from the young versions of Rhaenyra and Alicent's children to the teenaged versions of their children. But let's see if they keep saying that in dialogue, or, dear God, if they even have a maester reading out, here is this letter given in the year 115. That'd be so cool if they don't shy away from giving dates, but are showing off their work. That, oh look, we're actually keeping track of our timeline enough that we state calendar dates instead of hiding from it. Cosmic. But overall, I'm happy with this, that the math works out for how old everyone is, and that we actually have a calendar system now and a timeline. And we're going to be keeping track of this throughout the season.